Hey, mental workers, and welcome back to the podcast. Did you know that there's this really big, scary exam that some psychologists need to sit in order to gain their registration? Yeah, it's called the National Psychology Exam, and today's episode is all about it. What it is, who takes it, what's the structure, how the hell do you prepare, how do you cope with not passing, how do you cope with passing, self-care, and everything in between. And here to help unpack this topic is our fabulous guest, Amanda Moses. Hey, Amanda.
Hi, Bronwyn.
So excited to have you here. Amanda is a psychologist. She's fantastic. She's really out there for early career psychologists. And you just joined us at AAPI being our early career rep. Is that right?
That's right. Yes, I'm so excited to be on the team. I joined up as the early career coordinator.
Nice. That is so cool. So listeners, Amanda is all about early career psychs, and I really value her authenticity and genuineness in really caring about us.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. She's also got a course on the NPE. We'll talk about that a bit later, but just so you know, Amanda's got it. She knows what's up. She knows how to go about it. I hope that doesn't place too much pressure on you, Amanda.
It's a little bit of pressure, I'll be honest.
I'll lower the standard. Amanda knows some things.
Please. Some things.
So I'll just introduce listeners to the National Psychology Exam, which I'm going to refer as NPE because National Psychology Exam is a bit of a mouthful and I know that I'll stuff it up. The people who take the NPE are people who are doing the 4+2 pathway, which has now been phased out since last year, and also people who do the 5+1 pathway. I think people also do it if, say, they've come from overseas and then they have to do some period of supervised practice and then they have to take the NPE as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. People doing the transitional programs, but also people that are returning to practice, perhaps after lengthy periods of being out of the kind of psychology workforce. When they're returning, they're having to undergo certain provisions on their registration. And for some, that includes having to sit the National Psychology Exam.
Oh, okay. And with the NPE, my understanding is that it's designed to assess the competencies required to practice safely as a generally registered psychologist. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's designed to ensure that the people sitting the exam, so provisional psychs, can demonstrate that they've met those core competencies that are expected of them during their internship pathway.
Fantastic. And with the NPE, we'll get into the structure of it and how do you prepare. But I just want to flag to listeners that I have sat the National Psychology Exam. I think I sat it 2 or 3 years ago. And so throughout this episode, I'm going to have flashbacks to that time. It was so stressful. It was so nuts sitting the exam, but hopefully we can get through some good tips.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having you here with your kind of valuable lived experience of sitting the exam not so long ago is definitely going to be helpful for all the listeners.
Excellent. So, Amanda, is this going to be like a top tips type thing? Have we got a BuzzFeed list style thing that we're going to go through?
I do have a little bit of a BuzzFeed style list.
Okay.
There are some things that I think with now working with people who are preparing for the exam for a while now, I've kind of narrowed it down to a handful of things that I feel like are most valuable and most helpful for people to think about when they're wanting to prepare, starting to prepare, and also talking to those, of course, who have sat and have potentially failed the exam and now looking at resitting and thinking about some strategies and tips specific to those people as well.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. So just before we get into our list then, I just want to introduce the exam a bit more. So the pass mark is 70%. Is that still current?
Yeah, but it's kind of weird the way they do it. It's that like they scale the scores and it's all based on the performance of the cohort that sit the assessment. Yeah, and you never really quite know what your score is.
I didn't know.
Just know what. Yeah, like you see where you sit in comparison to that cohort, and they base like this passing mark on, the majority and how everyone performed and where you are relative to the cohort. And so if you pass or if you fail, you'll only know kind of the margin in comparison to that cohort and to what they've deemed that passing mark to be for that exam.
Oh, that's much better than it was for me. For me, it was just pass or fail and you get the email. So I didn't know where I sat relative to others. I was just like, oh, thank God I passed.
Yeah. And I think it's more specific. I should mention that I think that's more specific to people who fail, that when you get your email to say, look, you failed, they'll give you a little bit of a visual to show you where you were in comparison to the cohort, and also where you were, where your domain scores were relative to your best score.
Oh,
so
that's really
where
helpful.
your strengths and weaknesses were. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's so helpful, rather than having that awful fail and just feeling that you have no way of knowing where you could improve.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And as well, I just want to bring up the cost of the National Psychology exam as well. I remember it being about $300. Do you know how much it costs?
I think it's about $400 to $500 now.
Okay, cool.
For a sitting.
Cool.
Give or take around $400 to $500.
Yeah. So for a provisional psychologist, this was pretty pricey for me. And I reckon it'd be pricey for other psychologists as well. And it's just a big task to undertake. I remember studying for about 6 months for the exam at least, and I was thinking about it on my mind before then. And so it's just built up. I think for us early career psychs and for provisional psychs, it's built up to be this really huge thing. And I think that's where we're going to touch on this later, but some of the shame and embarrassment can come from not passing, but it's actually quite common not to pass.
Yeah, I agree. It's such a great point, because I think it's one of those things that just aren't spoken about. And I know that I work with many people, following a failure of their NPE, and many come to me with this same sentiment that they feel that it's a reflection of them, or that this is somehow meaning that they are not going to be a capable or competent psychologist. And for these people, I always like to attempt to reaffirm to them that, sitting and passing a national psychology exam, while it, of course, is important, it's part of our requirements with AHPRA to get registered, much of it is actually a reflection of how good you are at exams.
I agree.
It's not necessarily a reflection of whether or not you're going to be a fantastic psychologist. There are so many more ingredients to being a good psychologist than remembering a whole host of information and being able to respond to that in a very stressful situation.
I completely agree, because when I was sitting the exam, and I'm sure this is covered in your exam prep as well, but it is a lot about how the questions are asked and then what the answers to select from are. So just to make it clear to listeners, the NPE is a multiple choice exam. The whole thing is multiple choice. And so if you imagine, it's trying to sometimes pick between very similar answers and trying to determine what it is that the board wants you to select and kind of getting into their mindset. And so I agree with that it's not a reflection on your skills and capabilities as a psychologist. Rather, it is your skills and capabilities taking a very difficult exam.
I agree. That's a good point. I think that, for a lot of people, and even just the style of the exam, like some people may have strengths in sitting multiple choice style exams, and some people may find that a completely daunting, overwhelming task because having that decision paralysis. And when you have so many competing answers, and as you said, often two look exactly the same, and which one do I choose, can be very overwhelming, very anxiety provoking for people. And again, I think passing this exam there's so much more to it than whether or not you're a good psychologist. A lot of it comes down to strategy, your preparation, how well you are versed in the materials that you need to prepare for the exam as well.
Yes, definitely. So having touched on that, we'll come back to it at the end as well, when we give our nice space for people who have failed the exam and help them feel reaffirmed and valued and you guys are okay. But let's get to your tips for the exam. Have you got can we do a drum roll? Brrr.
Yes, and I've kind of split them off into parts. So there are tips I speak to that are really specific to your preparation and study. And then there are the tips about the day off, actually approaching the exam, and maybe a little bit more about exam strategy, which I'm sure you could provide some tips on too, given that you've recently sat and passed. So should we start with kind of preparation?
Yeah, I think prep is really important. Yeah, let's do that.
Do you mind if I ask you, Bronwyn, because obviously you've only sat it, only a few years ago as well, but what were some of your methods for preparing for the NPE?
Excellent question. Okay, so what I did was, because I was having some financial strain during my provisional studies, as many provisional psychs do, because we're having to pay for supervision and maybe we're not being paid very much money, I tried to make it cost effective and I actually started my own study group. So I got other provisional psychs and we would study every month or so. I think we were studying fortnightly at one point, but what we would do specifically is I bought and I can't remember the other author, but I know one of them's name is Pelling, and I brought this NPE exam prep book. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I don't like it. Yeah. And the reason for that is because the content is fine. We were able to get through the content, but the editing of the book was very poor. And I feel bad saying that, but it's actually true in that I would pick up typos on every page and that just made my brain go nuts. So I did that, studied the book, got the book text list, studied that, and did as much testing as I could. So the testing was very important.
I have a love-hate relationship with the Pelling and Burden book, the one you're talking about. It's the Elements of Applied Psychological Practice in Australia. And my love factor is that I'm like, okay, like it kind of just summarizes really succinctly but very briefly some of the main aspects of things to know. And I appreciate that at the end of the book there is that opportunity to practice through, I think they've got like 100 maybe practice questions.
Yeah, lots of questions.
Which is great. But my hate side, and nothing obviously personal to the authors, is that I think that it's used incorrectly and it's promoted in a way that leaves people with the impression that all I need to do is read that book and then I'm set for the exam, which is wild because the reading list is so long, it's so extensive, the curriculum is extensive. I've read that book and I can say very confidently that it does not cover even half of what you need to know for the entire exam. It just skims the surface. So it's not enough to prepare you.
Yes, I've noticed that as well. And when I sat the exam, the questions can also be different, which makes sense because I guess the authors were not permitted to take questions exactly from the exam. That wouldn't be allowed. So it's important to remember that those questions are an adaptation of what appears in the exam as well.
Yeah, definitely, which is interesting because it actually brings me to my first tip with preparation, which was around reading the reading list and looking at your curriculum because it's surprising. Like I know this sounds obvious, but it's surprising how many people don't. There are many people I've worked with that are like, what curriculum, what are you talking about? Or what reading list exactly you're referring to? And I like to point people to that and telling them that, this is your Bible for the NPE. Essentially, the curriculum is what is telling you what you need to know. It's detailed, it's quite clear and easy to follow. The reading list is where you source the information from to answer those questions. And so you will not get all that information sufficiently in one book. You need to read widely. And I know that that can be a barrier for many people due to the cost. And I completely get that buying the entire reading list may not be financially accessible for everyone. And it may be about thinking a little bit creatively, can I borrow some of these from a library? Can I access some of them? I know a couple of the textbooks are in the RP book section. So if you're a member of AAPI, for example, some of those textbooks are available for you as part of your membership. Can you buy them secondhand? Can you pull together with a group of people and purchase some books and you'll share them, take turns with reading them, so things like that. But I suppose main point is not to neglect it. And the way that I approached, so when I was developing my course, I, of course, read the whole reading list to make sure that I was being really efficient with, the content I was going to put together. And so the way that I approach it and the way that I encourage my supervisees to approach it is start with your curriculum, break it down domain by domain, review the exact things that it is that they want you to know, refer to your reading list, pull the relevant textbooks, and then make sure that you can confidently almost tick off each subsection of the curriculum to say, yeah, I've addressed that in that reading, or yes, I understand that now, or yes, I get that, perhaps before moving on to the next section. So the reading list and curriculum go hand in hand. They're very important. Don't neglect them.
Yes, great tip.
My next point was about when you are reading, learning, perhaps watching videos, whatever your method is when you are studying for the NPE, is ensuring that you are taking time to actually understand and reflect on the content, because I get that reading textbooks can sometimes be very dry. Watching video content, even for hours on end, it can be hard to stay focused and engaged. And so what I would say is that if you can, after every major point, I would pause, whether it's a book you're reading or a video you're watching, take some time to reflect on what it is that you actually understood from that content, and then write it down in your own words. Don't just write word for word what you've read or heard. Write it down in your own words in a way that makes sense to you. I came across something interesting recently from a neuro psychologist, I think it was, and them talking about that, how we know that the very best way that people learn and remember is through that. It's through being able to summarize something in your own words, but actually writing it, not typing. So there's something about writing
I've heard
that helps us. Yeah, it helps it. You kind of embed it in your memory, which I thought was cool.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point as well, because literally when we had your first tip, I was like, oh, but you can read all the texts and then still just be like not knowing anything because you've just read them on autopilot. So you really need to write down the material in your own words. And I would say as well, something that I did was apply it as much as I could to clients in my current practice. So that was a way that I would remember it. So I'd be like, if I was looking at the K10, I'd be like, how would I use this K10 with one of my clients? And that would help me to remember, but also elaborate, because then I would apply it to a real thing and it just make it a bit more real for me. It didn't work so much because there are parts of the curriculum that ask you about some forensic questions or org site questions, and I was working in a clinical setting. But just applying it and elaborating on it in as many contexts as you can, I found was helpful.
Yeah, I can see how that would be really beneficial. And I know that there are some people as well that I've worked with that they find taking that content and say then even maybe explaining it to someone else.
That's a
so
great
maybe
idea.
Sitting down with a friend or their partner and being like, hey, can you let me ramble off for 10 minutes about, I don't know, differential diagnosis and, allowing them to explain it in their own words can also help maybe cement it
It
a
totally
little bit
does.
more in there.
Yeah.
I think it does for me as well. Like I know it helps me with learning.
Yeah, it totally does, because you can think you know something in your head, and then when you try and explain it to people, you're like grasping at straws and you're just like, okay, clearly I don't know this, and can really help you solidify that concept.
My next tip was around kind of time management and planning. And my recommendation to people, because I do get asked a lot, like, when should I start preparing for the NPE? And how long should I give it, And I think that answer can be a little bit complex because it can really depend on your life circumstances. Like, what are the demands in your life? What's going on in your life? Are you working full time? Are you potentially raising a family? How much time do you have to dedicate to it, basically? And for most people, I would say that if you want to take a really relaxed approach and you don't want to be too kind of stressed and spending, all your spare hours on studying, I would say a year feels like a nice amount of time.
I would agree.
Yeah. And then if you want to go at it a little bit more, I suppose, a little bit more head on, and you're willing to be able to give it many hours of your week, I would say perhaps 6 months. But I feel that no less than really no less than 3 months. Like that would be somebody who's able to study every single day and all weekend. Like,
yes.
I don't know how you do it.
Oh, that makes me feel stressful when I think of preparing for it in 3 months. I wouldn't recommend it.
I wouldn't either. I feel like 6 to 12 months just feels like a nice amount of time and is reflective of how much content there is to cover.
There's so much content to cover and just so much to learn and integrate and apply and think about the situations that AHPRA want you to apply it to, and then also preparing yourself for sitting the exam itself, because it's different to know the content and then it's different to sit the exam.
I agree. And also even just like applying that knowledge. So I feel like the thing about the exam that I understand is that it's not just getting you to recall facts.
Yes.
Like you're actually having to remember something, but then do something with it and kind of use that knowledge in a very applied way, which I think takes a much deeper level of learning and understanding.
It really does. And you're right. It specifically says, I think, in the curriculum, and I remember this, but it's not rote learning. They want you to apply it. And that's how they're testing your applied knowledge, not just your ability to rote learn things.
Yeah. And I think that's where I would say, like, you just need more time for that. You need more time to be able to understand it so you can apply it. It's not just memorizing facts.
No, definitely not. Okay. Next tip.
The next thing I would talk about is probably around getting support. And I know you mentioned, Bronwyn, about being in like a peer study group. I think that's a fantastic idea. And I encourage that for people. Like, is there scope for you to, and if you're someone who works well in groups as well and kind of needs that accountability, I understand that not every single person works well in a team environment. Some people work a lot better independently. So obviously know yourself and know your strengths and, you know, what works best for you. But having that support can be really valuable, and that may look like being in a peer study group where everyone's holding themselves accountable and they're meeting regularly to review notes and review readings and kind of unpacking it together. It may also look like working on exam prep with your supervisor. And it's interesting because my understanding when I was going through the board-approved supervisor training is that it's expected that me as a supervisor should know all this so I can support my supervisee. But from what I'm hearing from provisional psychs is that some of their supervisors just don't know enough to assist them, or kind of maybe pass them off and say, oh, you might need to find someone else for this or get support elsewhere. And so not all supervisors have this kind of area of skill. So whether it's your supervisor, maybe it's another supervisor, but if that's something that you want to, I suppose, access, that can be quite valuable, having that one-on-one support with someone. And of course, there's always the options of doing, something like an exam preparation course.
Yeah. No, for me, it wasn't an option to seek support from my supervisor. They said that they weren't equipped to assist me, which is one of the reasons why I did the study group. And that's really interesting that you're reflecting that there seems to be other provisionals who are saying that their supervisor is kind of like, I'm not up for this. And as well, it really needs to, I think, be a supervisor who can really get in the head of the board and explain to you as a supervisee, this is why I would have selected this answer, or here is how I would apply it, and this is why I wouldn't select these other answers. And really seeing it from that perspective would have been helpful. Just on the study group, I did find it really helpful to have the study group. What we did was we agreed to read specific chapters from the Burden and Pelling book, and then we would go through the questions together. And I loved that because somebody would be like, oh, I thought it was A, I thought it was C. And then we would have a discussion about why we thought the different things and then go check the correct answer. So it was such a great test of application and just discussing it with each other in that way.
Yeah, I could see that, and just even be able to talk it out and use others as like a soundboard would be so valuable.
It brought up lots of interesting issues as well. It's like we'd be talking about a question. See, I like this because I have ADHD. So I'm like, oh, great, like trains of thought that go elsewhere. So yeah, I hear what you're saying, Amanda, about like your learning style, but for me, it was perfectly suited.
Yeah, I think so I'm probably maybe the opposite. Like I feel like for myself, I'd probably learn better alone.
Okay, yeah.
And I'd learn better individually. I probably would not do well trying to learn in a group environment. Like I would definitely do better by myself,
Yeah,
stick my head in the textbooks, get it done. But we're all so different, and that's okay. And I think it's like just recognizing, well, what actually works for you, and I'm going to work with that and work with myself, not against myself.
Absolutely. Yeah, do whatever you need to do to suit your own learning style.
But do be mindful, I think, of just making sure that when you're getting and seeking support, just make sure it's from credible sources, because I think that like my little gripe is that I think I see some like terrible advice online.
Oh, no.
And like, you know, just again, probably speaking to what I mentioned earlier about people saying, you know, don't worry about the reading list. Just read these 2 textbooks and that's all you got to do.
No.
And I'm like, no, stop saying that. So like things like that. It's just making sure that obviously if you are seeking and getting support, and if it is through your peers, that's wonderful. But don't rely on that as maybe your only source. Make sure you're still doing your required learnings, because you may find that your peers are no more knowledgeable than you are.
Yeah, totally.
And so maybe it's about where can I seek support from someone who's got the skills and competencies, or where can I develop my own skills and competencies through learning the material?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I'd say to any listener that's seeing stuff online, just ask yourself, has this person written the exam? If no, just have a think about whether they're interpreting something that might not be directly from the board. Whereas if you do say a course where somebody like yourself has put a lot of thought into what is going into that course and is following the curriculum and the textbook list, that's what is directly from the board, and that's what will be in the exam.
Yeah, I think so. And I suppose I'm not even saying that to make people feel like, only, you know, come and take my services.
Yes,
I'm sure there are many people that have credible service. Yeah, I'm sure. But I suppose I always say that as a caution, because I don't want people to be steered in the wrong direction. No. So I know how overwhelming it is for people sitting the exam, preparing for the exam, the cost, the time that goes into it. And I think that just making sure you're using credible sources, whether that's your reading list and curriculum, whether that's getting support through a kind of credible supervisor who's got that skill, or doing a course that is from a credible source.
Yeah, no, I think your intentions come across as quite genuine, Amanda. You don't come across as a shoddy salesperson.
I hope not. Yeah. And most people that know me, I hope would attest to that too.
But like, I would just hate it if somebody is, I don't know, they go down the wrong path.
Exploited.
Exploited. Absolutely. And it's just like, oh no, you can prepare in 2 weeks. Just read this textbook and that textbook and you'll be fine. And then they pay $500 to sit an exam and then they don't pass. That's very disappointing.
It is. And actually, this might be a little bit off topic, but there's been this little online scam happening the last week. A few of my provisionals kind of got in contact with me to say, hey, Amanda, guess what? They're on some Facebook group, not mine, but some other Facebook group where someone has posted like a catfishing thing where they're like, hey, I've just passed my exam. If you want tips, come and message me.
Wow.
They message them. And then they're like, oh, yes, I did a course with this man named, I don't know, Daryl something.
Yeah.
And he is in America and this is the cost. And they're catfishing people to these like scammy courses for the NPE. And I'm like, I can't believe that this is happening. And these poor provisionals, I don't know anyone that's kind of wasted any money yet, which is great.
Yes.
But they contacted me just asking about it, and you can clearly see it's definitely a scam. And but it's just, again, it's sad because these people are so vulnerable, and I think that people will and do prey, where there's vulnerability at times. And yeah,
totally. That's so crazy. I can't believe people are preying on provisionals like that. But oh my gosh, it really reinforces the point. Credible sources, people. Okay.
Credible sources.
Yeah.
Okay. Next tip. If you are in your 4x2 pathway, I would say to you that if you can, if it's feasible, do your mandatory assessments first, just because they double up a study. So when you have to do your administrations and scoring and reporting of the things like your waste, your WISC, your WIMS, your PAI, all of this is really valuable study for the exam, because they are I suppose they are some of the very big assessments that you need to know for the exam in more depth. So having done them, having learnt them, having used them, that kind of applied knowledge is what's probably going to assist you with sitting the exam. So if it's possible, do those first, and that will double up a study for the NPE.
Agreed.
The next thing I would say would be around, I think self-care, is a big one that I don't want to neglect here, is just talking about the fact that it's really overwhelming. It's anxiety provoking for most people. It's a huge and daunting task. And you're right, Bronwyn, that for a lot of people, there's a lot of emphasis on the exam, preparing for it, sitting for it. There's a lot of exam-related anxiety I see in provisionals. And I suppose I just want to say to people that, don't neglect your self-care in exchange for this. Yes, it's important. You need it to be licensed as a psychologist. I don't want to deter from, how important this task is. But in saying that your mental health and your well-being is more valuable, and you passing or failing an exam is not, again, it's not a reflection of you or your competencies. So I think that, a lot of these tips that we've spoken about today, Bronwyn, probably feed into self-care anyway. Thinking about spacing it out so you're not putting that much pressure on yourself in a really short period of time, getting support, having that guidance around you, making sure that you're studying effectively. All of those things probably feed into self-care anyway. But yes, please just make sure that you're taking care of yourselves while you're studying so that you don't get to the exam or get to the other side completely
exhausted.
Yes, completely exhausted. Because then I don't know, what's it all for, right?
Yeah, and you're not likely to do as well either. So it's like if you arrive in an exam completely exhausted, tired, it's like how good is your memory and attention going to be? Probably not optimal.
No, exactly. How are you going to be able to concentrate or attend or do your best if you are not at your best?
Yeah.
So you're right. That will also impact your performance. So very important, I think, to think about.
Yeah, I agree. And I hear you on the spacing it out. For me, that was really integral, giving myself enough time to prepare for it. What I did was I actually printed out all of the APS guidelines and I went to my university printing service and then bound it in a little book, and I printed out all the DSM diagnoses that we needed to learn, printed them into a book, and then I'd read one over breakfast every day. This is the nerd life that I did for several months. But being able to space that out, there's a lot of guidelines to read. There's a lot of diagnoses to learn. And that's just 2 parts of the 4 domains that the exam is assessing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So spacing it out, there's just so much knowledge to get into your brain and to be able to apply, I found was really helpful in terms of self-care.
Yeah, I think so. I think just as you said, spacing it, giving yourself adequate time, not overloading yourself, not overwhelming yourself is self-care. And it's making sure you're giving yourself the best shot at the exam.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Next tip.
Well, I feel like in terms of preparation, I am probably at the end of my kind of top tips for prep, but I can speak to exam strategy type tips if that will help, and day off stuff. But I'm curious if you think maybe I've missed anything. Do you have anything else maybe that could be for prep?
Any tips for preparation? I would echo what Amanda has said about following the curriculum. It's really important. That is what is going to be on the exam. And I'd say getting in the mindset of the board, because there are answers that you might think are correct, but they're not what the board is looking for. So it's a different mindset to get into the exam and to thinking about what your priorities are with answering questions, particularly ethical questions. So one of the things that really helped me was knowing that our commitment is to the client first and foremost, and that we do everything in the best interest of the client. And then it's the public, the community, the profession, and then you as the psychologist. So it's one of those things that I learned in studying for the exam, and I found that it's really helpful to be able to get into that mindset. Otherwise, I think you've done a great job, Amanda.
Thanks, Bronwyn. It's I was like trying not to laugh as you said that, because it's like that reality that, like, really first and foremost, it's the client. You're very much at the bottom of the list of the priorities. Yeah. No one cares about you as a psychologist. Like the client's number one, then it's the community, then it's the standing of the profession, and then you're somewhere down the bottom of the list. So it's like, I think it's a good thing to remember in terms of, even exam strategy, and like when you're answering questions, thinking about like those kinds of levels of priority, like who is really the most important person here and who am I looking to protect, and looking at those interests there, because your interests aren't going to matter as much as the clients or the community or the standing of the profession. And so that can assist in how you go about answering questions too.
Yeah, totally. So having some of those overarching concepts I found really helped me, because like there's going to be a question that's just like, a serious event has happened. Whose needs do you attend to first? And it's going to be like, give the psychologist a coffee. And you'll be like, the psychologist could use a coffee. But that's like, but that is down the end of your list.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Exactly. It's not even on the consideration. That's a really good one, I think, for exam strategy. Yeah. And so let's maybe do some tips then.
Yeah.
I've got some things maybe to talk to
I'm
specifically
excited
about day off exam strategy.
Let's do it.
So I'm just going through my list. I think the first one might just be talking to like time management stuff. Like the fact that we know that there's 210 minutes and 150 questions, and it leaves you roughly like 1.4 minutes for every question. And so in that, it's making sure that you designate an appropriate time for each question and not spending too long on each question. Yes. So on the day of, knowing that I've only got just over a minute to answer this, if I'm not going to answer it in that time, move on.
Yes.
Because you need to accumulate as many points as you can to pass. And therefore, you really want to just get to the end of the exam, answer as many questions as you can, and then you can circle back if you have time to those ones that you got stuck on. So do not allow yourself to get stuck on one question for more than a minute, because you are potentially losing points in other domains that you may have strengths in.
Definitely.
The next thing I would talk about would be really thinking about what's the question asking you? Like the question in front of you, is this a ethical question? Is it an intervention question? Is it an assessment question? And there are going to be some telltale signs. And some of this is about being really familiar with your curriculum and knowing what goes where. So, for example, getting a question about, hypnosis or recovered memories, I automatically know that's an ethical question, because they're not things that I need to know as part of the intervention domain. And so while I present looking like they're asking you about an intervention and what do I do, it's actually asking you an ethical question, and you need to make an ethical choice. And so really being able to understand and identify which domain this question falls into is likely going to help steer your answer as well. The next thing I would say is about not making assumptions beyond what is in the question. And I know many people struggle with this, that when they read something, their mind takes them kind of quite far into, these scenarios and thinking about all these extra factors that aren't actually in the question. And so I would say to you that take the question at face value. Don't make assumptions that are not in that question. Anything that APRA wants you to know will be there in that paragraph. And if it's not there, don't assume it. So don't assume that they're living in a remote location if it hasn't said that.
Yes.
Don't assume anything about the client's age if it hasn't said that specifically, or about their presentation or background or whatever else. Just really focus on what it's asking you, the content that is provided to you. Do not make assumptions beyond what's in that scenario.
Yeah, that's really helpful. During the exam, I would read the question out loud to myself, like whisper it, because I wanted to make sure that I was just focusing on what the question was saying to me and do exactly what you are warning against and not bring in additional information. So it's like the board is saying these are the options. What do I need to select based on the information I'm given and with the options that I'm given?
Very important. I think also another thing is, I mean, you already mentioned about like whose welfare are we considering and knowing that obviously the client comes first. But it can also be helpful to ask yourself, like, who is the client here?
Yes.
Because we know that depending on someone's age, who the client is going to change. So we know, for example, if they're under 8, the client is the parent. If they're between 8 to 14, it's going to be the parent. It can be negotiable. Like you can negotiate to get some extra confidentiality and things like that. But ultimately, if the parent says no, it's no. The parent's the client. And beyond kind of 14, you're really having to consider if that person has the capacity to understand the service that's being provided to them, to be able to consent and everything else for you to be able to determine if they're the client or not. But typically from the age of kind of 16 on, that person's your client. So sometimes the question, particularly if they're talking about children and adolescents, it can be very helpful to first remind yourself who is the client here, because that sometimes may also sway how you answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Because then it'll be like, well, who do I owe my duty of confidentiality to?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Very important. I think the last thing I would say maybe about exam strategy without kind of, because I think I could talk to this for a lot longer, and I do have a kind of complete section in my course that talks about tips and tricks and things like that, but I feel like I could talk to this for an hour. So without kind of delving into all of the content too much, which I know you're all going to be studying, I think the last thing I would say is just really think about things like taking a perhaps more conservative approach to some of your answers and trying to think about it from the perspective of APRA, not necessarily from yourself. Like, you know, what feels fair to me? Like you may get questions about, for example, like, oh, the client can't afford to pay anymore. What do I do? And a part of you may be feeling like, well, I'll just refer them on. I don't want to work for free.
Yeah.
Right. But that's unlikely how APRA would want you to respond. And I think it's just, you know, with certain questions, really thinking about what would APRA expect of me here? What are they wanting me to know, and what are they wanting me to say? And really sometimes approaching it in a conservative way and trying to almost use your APRA lens, maybe, like really trying to, again, just take it from their perspective and be a little bit more conservative in your answers.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And for that question as well, it would be like, make reasonable provisions to ensure continuity of service for clients who are in financial strain. Because I think that's almost the exact line in the Code of Ethics. So, you need to know the Code of Ethics really well. But if you take that overarching advice to be, I guess, quite conservative in your answer and not be like, well, what's fair to me, then, that's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, and that probably kind of filters into a little bit about, you know, what we're talking about first, like priorities of care. Like obviously first it's the client, then it's the community, et cetera, et cetera. And also maybe just thinking about, like sometimes you'll find that there are going to be various answers that look correct.
Yeah, I hate that.
And it may, and quite often, obviously, they do that to confuse you. And sometimes there are answers that are both correct, but what you're needing to figure out is what is your first step? Because maybe, you know, for example, if you get a question around, I don't know, risk assessment or something like that, or someone seems potentially suicidal and they've got depression, it's going to be true that both you have to do a risk assessment for suicide and engage in CBT for depression. But what are you going to do first? You're going to do the risk assessment first. And that's not an example of an MPE question, of course, because I don't know the questions, but I just mean that you really have to think about where there are two true answers, and there can be, what's the first thing that you need to do, and that will hopefully be the correct answer.
Yeah, there were so many questions like that where you just had like more than one answer that could be correct, and you need to, that's why I found in the preparation, knowing why answers aren't correct was really helpful for me, because then I could be like, which is more correct, which is wanting what they want me to get out of this question. So knowing the domain that it's looking for was really helpful as well. And knowing why specific answers aren't correct. So you wouldn't deliver CBT first before before doing a risk assessment because you need to manage risks first. That might be of immediate risk to the client's safety and well-being, but also might affect their ability to engage in therapy.
Exactly. So important. And I think that's probably some of the value in doing a lot of practice before your exam as well. And I know there are loads of practice exam stuff floating around online, like some are good, some aren't so good, some are in between. But I think getting as much practice in as possible before the exam, particularly like quality stuff where, as you said, there's some sort of an explanation as if this is the answer, why is it the answer?
Yes.
Or why isn't it the answer?
Yeah.
And that way you're able to understand and take something away from that, because I think that could be very valuable.
Yes, definitely. Any other tips?
Look, in terms of exam strategy, I think that there are some like key points that I would speak to for every single kind of intervention and assessment that you can maybe look at to remember key aspects of them, and maybe making a little bit of a summary sheet. That is something I delve into a lot more in my course. But in terms of very quick tips and strategies, I think we've covered the main gist of things for preparation and for kind of day of exam strategy type thing.
Yeah, I do want to add in a few tips for on the day. Is that okay?
I'd love that.
One of the things that happened to me during my exam was that, so during the exam, you can flag questions to return to later. And so you can either answer the question or you can flag it to return to later. Great feature. But for me, I flagged too many questions. I remember flagging about 80 questions. And this is an exam with 150 questions. So I flagged, around half. And I just found that this was a pain in the ass to return to, and it made me more stressed. And I think I flagged all the early questions that I wasn't sure of. And I was like, I'm not really sure of that. But I wish if I had to go back again, that I try to encourage myself to make the decisions and not have as many flagged questions, because I was just a little bit nervous and I was a little bit too indecisive, but it made it more stressful to return to later.
Yeah, I think I've actually heard of or read a study that speaks to how usually in multiple choice situations, your first answer is usually correct, and people that go back and maybe change their answers apparently tend to more kind of a higher percentage of the time, a higher degree of the time, end up changing it to the wrong answer.
Yes.
That usually your first instinct is a good instinct.
I bet I did that for so many questions. Yeah, just changed it to the wrong answer. And it was just, it was so frustrating. So that's my tip there. The only other tip I have is that you can't bring in anything into the exam. It's such a pain in the ass for people like me who need something to do with their hands. The best I could do is that I emailed the exam invigilator to ask if I could bring my headphones in, and that kept me calm and okay. They had to check the headphones beforehand, I think, just to make sure there weren't any communication devices with the headphones. But if you're unsure about bringing anything in, just email the exam invigilator. You might be surprised with what they say that you can bring in to help you out. And I made sure that I kept the email saying that I could bring in my headphones on the day so that I could show it to the exam people. And that's if you're attending the exam at a venue. I think there's a lot of you at home taking nowadays.
Yeah, they've got, I suppose, the potential now to do it online. And it's interesting because I've heard very inconsistent and mixed feedback. Some people say to me, my experience online was horrible. I had tech difficulties. I got kind of logged out, or X happened or Y happened. Some people have fantastic experiences online because for them it's less distracting just being kind of alone and not having, maybe if you're sitting in an exam room with 100 other people, potentially that can be quite distracting for some. Some people had horrible experiences in person and vice versa. And so I think for you, that's probably a good point to even talk to, because I know a lot of people ask about that and speak about that, what's better, online, in person. And I think it's trying to obviously work out for you individually what kind of environment may work best for you, and also thinking about if you have a particular disability, or say if you do have ADHD, how you can go about accommodating yourself in that exam environment, which can be maybe very overwhelming. And even asking, I've had people ask me, people with with disabilities, what are my kinds of rights here, or what can I do? Can I ask for adjustments? Can I ask for accommodations? And yes, you can, and you should advocate
Absolutely.
for yourself. And, you know, you can actually contact AHPRA. And I know historically they have allowed people things like extra time and things as such that, you know, that need those accommodations. So please do advocate for yourselves if you have a disability or a condition that may make sitting the exam harder for you.
I agree. Yes, please advocate for yourself because it is a high stress situation and you will notice difficulties, I feel, if you don't advocate for yourself. It'll be harder for you.
Absolutely. And so I think, you know, just making sure that you do that and don't expect yourself to be, you know, performing based on kind of like, you know, maybe in the way that all your peers are. You know, if you do have a disability or a difference or something as such that just, you know, be kind to yourself, advocate for yourself, make sure you get the accommodations that you rightfully deserve.
Yeah, I agree. And with should I do it at home online or face-to-face online? Yeah, I agree with you that it's whatever suits you. I don't think there's one obviously that's better than the other. I think it's a personalised decision. For me, there wasn't the option to sit it at home online, but I went to a venue and then I sat it online with a few other people and there was kind of like walls between each participant. It was a little bit stressful because I was really mindful of I was trying to not appear to be cheating. I wasn't cheating, but it's like if you stand up and go to the toilet, you deliberately try very hard not to look at people's computers. And so the worst thing that I could imagine was like me glancing at somebody, like just turning my head and then the invigilator being like, oh, you're disqualified, you were cheating. And I'd be like, no.
Oh, that would have been so stressful.
That was stressful. So like if you're concerned about that, then I'd recommend at home but you can't. But you can, they also do check your home environment to make sure that you haven't got any like cheating materials.
Yeah, of course. Like if you need to get up, for example, and go to the bathroom and things like that, like all of that needs to be, I think like they have someone there watching you.
Yeah, I went to the bathroom.
Not go to the toilet. Watching you while you're doing the exam. And actually, I might just say quickly that there are two people I know of that failed their exam. They sat online, and the reason that they failed was because they started talking. They weren't talking to anyone in the room, but the way that they learn and process and understand is that they need to read things out loud to themselves. So they were sitting there looking at the questions and asking themselves, like reading it out loud.
Yeah, that's what I did.
Automatic fail.
Oh no! How disappointing.
Yes. I know. So it's little things like that I think some people aren't aware of that I suppose is worthwhile knowing. And if you are living in a regional, rural, remote area or just anywhere that doesn't have a good, stable internet connection, I would also consider whether actually sitting in person may be a better option because that is a point of stress and frustration. Yeah,
and then it's not on you, it's on them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I would say, you know, think about that. If you are going to do it online, just make sure that you've got a good enough internet connection, a reliable connection. You've got a quiet space to do it in. So hopefully that won't impact your sitting.
Yes. All good things to consider. Amanda, is this the time where we're going to give some space to people, just some further space to people who have failed the exam?
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about. I really want to normalize it and make people feel that this is something that, well, I'm not saying this to scare anyone or kind of incite fear about the exam, but it's common and people don't know it's common. And then when it happens to them, they feel like, I suppose, understandably heartbroken, but it also impacts their self-esteem and sense of self-worth and their idea of, I suppose, their competency as a psychologist. I've had so many people come to me say, Amanda, I failed the exam. Can you look at my results? Can you help me with this? And I think first and foremost, my role is always about helping them understand that this isn't a reflection of you. Please distance yourself from this narrative that you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not going to be cut out for the field, because actually a lot of this is about perhaps how good you are at sitting an exam, your exam strategy, your methods for studying, all of those other things that are separate to you as a psychologist. And so I do just want people to feel like it happens. It's common. People fail. And it's not about you per se, but it probably speaks to things that you're going to need to address for your next sitting. And so I usually run through a few things with people. And firstly, that's thinking about really like taking that time to reflect on your exam results. So for anyone that's failed, you do get a little bit of a graph to say, here's where you failed, here's by how much. It's like you get this kind of like this line and you'll see a passing mark and you'll see this red dot of like, where do I sit next to that passing mark? And for a lot of people, it's frustratingly so close. And then they'll give you another little separate section where they show you how you went in each domain, but relative to your own average score. So perhaps you did really well in the assessment section, but not so well in the ethics section. And this can be a place for good reflection of, okay, what were my relative strengths and weaknesses? Where did I go well? Where did I not go so well? And even just asking yourself things about the exam itself. Like when I was sitting there, what were the things that I got stuck on? What were the things that confused me? Where was I tripping up? Because all of these things can be really telling about where your kind of knowledge deficit is and what you're going to need to focus on.
Yes, I agree with that, like getting some distance from it, being like, look, this isn't about me as a person. It doesn't reflect on me not being good enough. And I just want to echo that, like, I found the exam really challenging and I studied for at least 6 months for the exam. I found it really hard and I actually walked out of the room convinced that I had failed. And I was like preparing myself for that, like mentally. I was like, I think I failed. I'll probably need to sit it again. That's okay. But I honestly thought that I had failed and that I was waiting for that email to say that you had failed. So I just want to echo that it's a really challenging exam. And there were some questions where I just, despite having studied the whole curriculum, I didn't know the answers to. And that's not meant to scare anybody, but they were just like maybe like 2 or 3 questions. And I was like, holy hell, like I did not prepare for that at all. They just seem like they come out of nowhere. And it was really gaps in my knowledge. Yeah, I just want to say it's a hard exam and there's no shame if you fail because a lot of us actually fail. And it just means that we need to distance ourselves, take a look at the areas that perhaps we haven't had the knowledge in or maybe the applied knowledge and have a go again.
Exactly. And I think as well, you know, just it's interesting because when AHPRA send failure letters to people and kind of give them at the top of the page is that often people fail because they underestimate how challenging the exam is.
Interesting.
And so some of this, yeah. And I actually have found in my experience that is relatively true.
Yeah.
That when I have sat down with people to be like, all right, talk me through it. What happened? And what were your methods for study? Like, how did you approach your exam study last time? More often than not, I'll be very honest, that mostly we're failing on the basis of only relying on 2 textbooks that I did speak about, right, as one of my first tips. Please read the reading list and the curriculum because a lot of people aren't doing it.
Oh, wow.
So I think it's really kind of recognizing, well, yes, I'm going to reflect on my exam results, but you also need to reflect on what were your methods for studying the first time around and be honest with yourself. Like, did you actually read that reading list? Did you cover it? Did you go through the curriculum? Were you only reading one textbook in hopes that that was enough to pass? That's the Elements textbook that I have the love-hate relationship with.
Don't just rely on that.
Please don't. So, you know, it's kind of being really frank with yourself and thinking about, did I actually give myself enough time? Did I actually cover enough content? And whatever you've done the first time, chances are you're going to need to do it completely differently this time.
Totally.
You need to change your tacks because whatever happened prior obviously didn't work. That's okay. You need to change your tactics in study. You need to likely read wider. You need to make sure that you are studying hopefully more effectively, more efficiently. If necessary, get support. I think there's a lot to kind of think about. And another little interesting thing that I think is important to note, because I've had a few people that I've worked with that haven't just failed once, but perhaps they failed 3 to 5 times.
Yep.
And that's okay. That's normal. So I want to normalize that.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is when we've reflected on that together is that what happens for some people is that they fail one time, they look at their results and say, oh, I didn't know enough about ethics. I'm just going to study ethics now leading up to this exam. And then they go do the next exam, go really well in ethics. And then there's, perhaps they haven't now done as well in assessments or interventions.
Everything leaks out the brain.
Yeah. So if you are resitting and you've failed previously, yes, you do want to make sure you address your kind of knowledge deficits and make sure you reflect on that, but don't neglect the other domains. Make sure you're still studying those too, because that's what I've noticed in a pattern of people that fail multiple times. Their results start fluctuating just because they're not giving the other domains enough time anymore.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And you will forget. It's just a natural consequence of human memory.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Amanda, is there anything else that you wanted to get across to listeners that we haven't touched on?
I don't think so. I think I think we've spoken to obviously tips for preparing, tips for kind of day off strategy type stuff. We've talked about, people that fail and maybe how they might go about tackling it the next time around. I think that kind of sums up the main parts.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for coming on. I think this was really helpful, and I think it will be a really great listen for anybody who's considering doing the National Psychology exam. Maybe you're at the start of your internship, maybe you're just considering doing the 5+1 and you have no idea what the National Psychology exam is. Hopefully this has given you an oversight. I really hope we haven't scared you off. I do feel like with good preparation, you'll be okay. And if you're not okay, that's okay. You'll be able to get some more help and you'll be able to pass. You're all good.
Yeah, I hope that's everyone's main takeaway, what you've said. That yes, I think it's doable. It's overwhelming, but it is doable. You just need to give yourself enough time, make sure you prepare adequately, that you're not skipping important parts like the reading list, and that if you don't pass the first time, it's okay. It's just an exam. I know it's disheartening, but it's not a reflection of you. You can pick yourself up and you'll likely pass the next time. Yeah. It's okay.
No biggie, friends.
No biggie.
Amanda, if listeners want to find out more about you or get in touch and they can learn about your NPE prep course, where can they find you?
So my website is www.amandamosespsychology.com.au. I'm also quite active on Facebook and LinkedIn. I posted a free service for quite a while now. It's called Exam Prep Tuesday. And every Tuesday I'll post up a new exam style question. Everyone jumps on, they get a chance to answer. And then at the end of the day, I'll provide the correct answer with a rationale. And so I do that just to support provisionals who are preparing for the NPE. It's a little bit of fun as well, no pressure. But my NPE course is quite comprehensive. It's online and self-paced, which means that you can do it in your own time. You can revise materials as many times as you need. I approached it by reading the entire reading list, and then I created the online course to address all 4 domains and every aspect of the curriculum that you need to know. Included in the course is video summaries, me explaining to you the content and summarizing the content that you need to know. There's additional readings and resources I've included. There's exam strategy tips. There's tips for planning and organization. And I've also got a practice exam in there too, where I will run through with you exam style questions, but I also provide you with the answers and rationale. So it's 34 hours of content and it's all loggable as professional development. So you can find that course and find out more about it on my website. And you're always welcome to reach out if you have any further questions about it.
Amazing. I will link to your website in the show notes, listeners. So just do a dive in there if you want to see what Amanda's got. And I'll pop in your LinkedIn profile as well.
Thanks, Bronwyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. Thanks, listeners, for listening. Catch you next time and have a good one. Bye.